Awesome. Well, my name's Lily. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Rime. We're building voice models for interaction. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, and yeah, I'm just excited. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, and I'm Shreyas. I am president and one of the co-founders of Miravoice. We build voice AI for precision data collection, and what that means in practice is we build voice AI to conduct phone surveys and interviews for survey researchers. So think political pollsters, market researchers, public opinion researchers, and folks like that.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about the history of that and how you see Miravoice fitting into the history of both opinion research, but also market research. And yeah, I'm excited to learn more finally about this.
Yeah. So the story here is I used to work at McKinsey, and while I was there, I did a number of studies that involved conducting interviews with a variety of folks. And I think one thing that's been abundantly clear over the last few years is that voice AI has gotten to the point that it can actually handle a lot of these types of conversations. And so when my co-founders and I were thinking about how we could best use voice AI to make some kind of a difference, the biggest area that we saw that voice AI could be useful in was in opinion research. So public opinion researchers are obviously trying to talk to tons and tons and tons of people. And the gold standard has always been the phone survey. Because of cost concerns in recent years, a lot more research has shifted towards web forms. But now with voice AI, we really firmly believe that we can get the quality of voice interviews at a cost that is much closer, at the very least, to asking people to fill in a web form. And the reason for that is quite simply that people talk more than they type. So if I get you in a conversation, I can probably get way more information about your opinions and how you think about the world than if I ask you to type me an essay. Frankly, when you ask folks to type you an essay, you're not going to get more than a couple of sentences max. And these days, you might even get some ChatGPT generated responses too.
So why do you think what does it mean that voice AI has gotten good enough from a modeling perspective that people are willing to engage with it more? Like why has that happened?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different dimensions to this. The first is that we are now at a time where voice models themselves sound pretty realistic. That's one of the reasons why we're so excited to be discussing this study and so excited to be speaking with you. So the voices themselves sound way more realistic than a decade ago when voices sounded much more robotic. You could easily tell at a glance that a given voice was clearly an automated system. And now we actually have the tools to give folks a voice that they feel comfortable speaking with. So that's kind of part one. Part two of this is, of course, the rise of LLMs. So because LLMs now exist, we have tools to conduct verbal reasoning that are much, much more complex and much, much more dynamic than the phone trees of yesteryear. So I think most folks have probably been asked to take a survey at the end of a call with, I don't know, an airline or something, where they ask you to rate things on a scale of 1 to 5. And very, very often, those types of calls involve you pressing a button on your phone to enter your input or saying something that involves just a very set list of choices, and there's not much logic that you can really build into the process. Now, we we do think that there's obviously quite a bit of importance to using structured studies. And in fact, our voice AI focuses on this kind of quantitative research as well. But the big thing that voice AI enables us to do now is react to many of the dynamic situations that pop up mid conversation. So, for example, respondents aren't always just going to answer your questions. They might ask you, the interviewer, questions back. And because
Mm.
LLMs exist, we can now react to those types of situations in a way that old school, what we called interactive voice response systems, or IVR, never could.
It sounds like what you're saying is there's two sides to this. Like, our tools for natural language understanding have gotten in the form of LLMs, have gotten a lot stronger, more capable, and therefore we're not no longer limited to like and I just experienced this by the way, and it was actually the first time that I had ever done it, but I had to rebook a flight on United last week after traveling back from Orlando, and I did do the post-call survey, and it was my first time ever, because I was curious about this, and it's true, it's still like on a scale of 1 to 10, I think it was 1 to 5 probably because you can't even do 10 on the 5
Yeah.
yard. So yeah, I think, you know, from my studies doing like perceptual research in linguistics, we would describe this as like some kind of Likert scale or right, like a
Exactly.
0 to 5, yeah. And I
It's
think
called the same
so
thing in
that's one
speech.
part of it is like we're no longer limited to like the same kind of things that you in essence could do with a radio button on a form. And then the other piece of it is like people are more willing to engage because the quality of the experience is higher.
Yeah, and one thing that we're especially interested in is in the survey research literature, there's this notion of social desirability bias. So I think one of the easiest ways to illustrate this is an anecdote that a lot of folks have heard about the 2024 election. There was some French guy on Polymarket who apparently ran his own surveys where he asked folks, "Hey, who are your neighbors going to vote for?" And then he bet a bunch of money using that study.
Mm.
And so the reason why he had been doing that was to combat something that we refer to as social desirability bias. So the idea is if someone is coming to you and asking for your opinion, and your opinion is something that may not necessarily be socially acceptable to admit, you might lie to the interviewer. What we're really curious about is, well, if you use an AI and you tell people, hey, you're speaking to AI, it's possible that you'll get better quality results too. So, one
Mm.
of the studies that we recently helped conduct was called the BERFIS, which is the CDC. It's basically a CDC public health study. It's the largest public health telephone study in the world.
Mm.
And we actually heard from some of the respondents that we spoke to that they were made to feel more comfortable by the fact that they weren't speaking to a human being. Because we were asking a bunch of really, really in depth questions about their medical history, what diagnoses they had experienced, how often they engaged in various activities. And when you're asking these kinds of invasive questions, it's possible that for at least some subset of the population, they'll feel more comfortable speaking to AI instead of a human being.
So, okay, then that's like the flip side, right? The flip side to the fact that like voice AI is now at a level of capability that people feel willing to talk to it. The flip side of that is because it's AI, people are also expressly more interested in divulging certain information than they would be if it was a human.
Potentially. Obviously, a lot more research is necessary to confirm that hypothesis, but the early signs are good, and we've definitely heard comments to that effect from respondents who take our surveys.
I mean, anecdotally, I think makes sense.
Yeah, I
Makes
mean,
sense to me.
yeah, I don't want to talk to some guy about my medical history either. I'd rather talk to AI as well. So,
Yeah, and moreover, right, like I think the 2024 election shows something similar, although in an orthogonal way, which is that like when you're not asking about when it's a human that's asking you about your opinions, you're probably less likely to say the right thing than if it's a human asking you about your neighbor's opinions,
yeah,
the right thing. And then the AI layer on top of that, again, orthogonal but related, which is like I don't have the same level of concern about being embarrassed.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so this is part of the reason why we're so excited to try to bring voice AI to the opinion research world or the survey research world. And, I think one other point that we haven't quite touched upon here is I think the needs of opinion research and data collection types of conversations more broadly are pretty different from the needs of, let's say, like a sales call or a customer
Mm.
support call. I think there's been a lot of attention, especially in the voice AI space, on sales and support. Obviously, they're incredibly large use cases. But data collection is a different beast because, in a lot of cases, you care more about the precision involved in the conversation than you do about persuasion, as you do in a sales call, or about actually solving someone's problem and giving someone good support as you would in a customer service type of context. And so what you're optimizing for in each of those three types of conversations tends to differ. So to make that really concrete for
Yeah,
you,
please.
in a data collection conversation, I don't want to bias the respondent. So I want to be
Mm,
really thoughtful about using the exact same language every single time that I ask a question. And if I get ambiguous responses, I'm probably going to want to probe them a little bit. Versus in a sales call, I think there's much more of a kind of natural push and pull where you're trying to figure out how best to advocate to a given person and close a sale. And so that requires a fundamentally different type of skill and a different type of conversation, and frankly, a different type of voice AI.
right.
And then in a support conversation, frankly, I feel like the integrations are the biggest part here, right? Like for a support conversation to feel successful, I want to feel as though my problem was resolved mid conversation. And so to that end, yeah, the conversation matters, but what's almost as important, in my opinion, is making sure that you have the integrations necessary to provide that support. In data collection, it's did we design the right study? Did we administer that study successfully? And is the data that we're getting back useful for some kind of decision making or for some kind of policy making?
There's an interesting interaction here, right? Because it seems to me, and this is like part of the reason why we're talking today, and part of the reason why we're connected whatsoever is that Miravoice uses rhyme, and I would say the thesis behind rhyme is people, by the way, misunderstand this often. Um, I'm not going to clear it up once and for all on this in this segment, but like people often misunderstand like the vision of rhyme is like we enable people to build applications in voice that people want to talk to, and I think people often mistake that for meaning that like we want to we want to put a voice in front of a caller that sounds just like that caller, right? Like that there is this
Yeah.
like similarity effect, but of course, like to your point, there seems to be something almost at odds with designing something where all else is kept equal in a world where the voice that you have someone interact with directly relates back to whether or not they interact with it in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if I'm kind of understanding what you're saying here, the right voice for the right use case isn't necessarily some specific person's voice. It depends on the context and it depends on what we're trying to achieve.
And then, yes, that's part one. And then part two is it can introduce a pretty huge confound when the voice, again, just hypothetically, that someone responds best to is like, that particular person is, a deep bass, older male Southern English
Yeah.
voice. And then you're asking, right? And you're asking some question about local politics, and the voice itself becomes, it becomes a dependent variable on the
Yeah. No, it
results of
it
this.
definitely does, and that kind of confounding is so fascinating, right? And, frankly, I mean, that particular question is one of the reasons why I was so excited about this study too, because it's so important for us to get the information that we need to try to tease apart the effects of different types of voices on the way that respondents or, frankly, anyone who's talking to an AI voice might behave, and there really isn't that much research that at least I was able to find about that.
Mm. But you have found some, right? Like, I think there's some research about the effect of gender on calling. This is pre-voice AI, I think, but there's some research on this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you define as voice AI, but yeah, there's definitely some research in the survey research
Right.
landscape that discusses the impact of the gender of a human interviewer on response rates. The studies that we looked at seem to find fairly null effects of what
Mm.
the gender of the human interviewer is, but I think there's a rich kind of body of survey research literature about this, and so I'm sure there's more out there that we haven't necessarily seen. That said, there's also some study on IVR systems, so interactive voice response systems from the last several years. It's just, I don't necessarily put a lot of credence into those because, as we talked about at the top of the conversation, voice models are so much better now than they were when all these old school tests of IVR systems were studying all of this stuff. Now we have actually realistic voices versus, I don't know, in the 2000s and 2010s, Sure, we had things that kind of approximated human voices, but the fidelity is just so much greater now, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, awesome. Well, do you want to get into this study? So, I mean, I can set the stage from my understanding of this study, and would love to hear just your background in the study. But and you can correct me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but it's my memory that you know you at Miravoice, you're building, right? Like you're building, you're selling, you're making hundreds of thousands of phone calls, and you have a lot of choices, obviously, in terms of the models that you use across the stack. And there's this sense, and this is by the way how everyone evaluates TTS in particular, that like there's a vibe, right? To each of the each model builder brings a very particular kind of craft to how they collect data, how they label data, the kinds of models they train, how the architectures relate to things like how much variability and pacing and duration there is, for example. All those decisions create a sum total sort of aesthetic about the particular set of voices. And it's kind of it was my understanding that you guys were like, we're fans of Rime, we're using Rime. The reason why, right, is because it really matters if someone hangs up, because if they hang up, we're not going to collect information for them. And I think the hunch that your team had at the time was like based on the vibe, right? Um, that
Yeah.
people would be staying on the phone with Rime more than others.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. So essentially, we did the same thing that I think most other voice AI companies have done, which is, hey, we tried out a bunch of different model providers, we listened to the voices, and I think what struck us about Rhyme was the mix of the cadence and the vocal inflection and the general timbre of the voices felt more real to us. And so because of that, we thought, hey, well, if we have more real feeling voices, we'll probably make our respondents feel more comfortable as well. Because, as I mentioned before, we're sometimes asking people fairly invasive questions. And so it's important to us that we create an environment for our respondents where they're not put off by the entity that they're speaking to. And, it was also important to us that we were using a voice or a set of voices that could accurately reflect the multitude of different speech patterns that exist in the US. And we really loved the selection that you guys had to offer, which is why we started using Rhyme to begin with.
And then okay, so but then we this is obviously like so hard in the market where there's leaderboards where people are like, I think by the way we're like right now I think we're at number 50 on the artificial analysis leaderboard of TTS models, which is so funny because like I mean I think it goes without saying like, and there's going to be increasingly like pushback from model builders about these super, it's funny, it's in the name actually, like artificial
Yeah.
leaderboard, right? Like I think so when you approached us and we're like, hey, we actually like want to prove this. Like we want to prove that like that that there's some difference between providers and the willingness of people to stay on the phone, but then also just measure as a preliminary finding, right? Like the delta between voices. So there's like this between provider effect, and then there's this between voice effect, right? And like I want to like set, I know I recognize this like very preliminary research, but maybe you could the set the stage for us, right? Like the methodology, um, the design. I mean, you guys think about this so in a similar way that we think about building the model, right? As like a craft. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, let's talk about that.
Sure. So, I mean, kind of the story here is once we started using Rhyme and once we got introduced, I think both of us were interested in understanding the relative differences between voices as well as providers in a variety of use cases. For us, we wanted to know, hey, like we have a general vibe that Rhyme voices are going to perform better for our survey research use case. We don't really have any data. And so I do want to be upfront that this was a study that Rhyme commissioned and funded, and Rhyme did get to provide input on which providers that we evaluated. So I want to be upfront about disclosing kind of how the study came to be and the funding behind it. But that said, we at Miravoice were the ones who designed the study, conducted the study, analyzed the study, and presented the study at the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers conference this year in Los Angeles. And so what I want to be clear about is RIME did not have any control over the data collection practices, any of the statistical analysis that we did, the interpretation, or any of the conclusions that we reached. That's solely on us at Miravoice.
Awesome.
So with that, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the methodology itself. So, in order for us to understand whether or not a voice performed better than another one, we essentially wanted to make a ton of calls to people all around the US. And so we got about 36,000 landlines from all around the US, and we put together a 9-question survey on local government and public transit, which we hoped would be a fairly neutral topic. I'm sure it's debatable. I'm sure we're going to hear from lots of folks about why that was not the right topic selection for this kind of a test, but we had to start somewhere. And
Yeah.
so what we wanted to do was keep the survey short, keep the survey generic, and talk to lots and lots of people. And so for those 36,000 landlines, we ended up conducting around 100,000 calls. I think the final number was something like 99.4 thousand or something like that. And so we conducted tons and tons of calls to folks all around the United States. In terms of the voices that we tested, we tried to test 4 voices from 3 different providers. The first was obviously Rime, the second was 11 Labs, and then the third was Google. We tried to test 2 male-coded voices and 2 female-coded voices as defined by the provider. I know that there's a lot of potential debate about what constitutes a male-coded voice or a female-coded voice. We just took the provider's labels at their word. And we tried to pick the voices that were listed as trending or most popular whenever possible.
Awesome.
So that's a little bit about, kind of the voices that we tested. That's a little bit about the overall design. I'm happy to talk about the logistics of making the calls, which is also really interesting. But does that make sense so far?
No, it makes complete sense. Yeah. Let's talk about the logistics.
Perfect. So one of the other things that we wanted to make sure that we controlled for was, well, if we call people at different times of day, depending on the provider or depending on the voice, obviously we're likely to get different results. So what we tried to do was we had every voice call a sample of our potential respondents at the exact same times of the day, so the exact same calling windows. We gave them all up to 3 attempts at a maximum to contact a given respondent. And we did not have any incentives whatsoever. So no one was getting paid to conduct the survey. It was all entirely free. We tried to have all calls happen at the exact same times of day and match calling protocols as much as possible. We also had a fairly lengthy disclosure at the beginning of the call telling the respondents that they were talking to AI. And this is really important to us, right? We don't want to evaluate how effectively a voice can trick people into thinking that they're speaking to a human. We want to evaluate which voices people are willing to speak to when they know that they're talking to AI.
Mm. Do you think that the disclosure changes how people respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like, we've definitely started to see in the survey research community, at the very least, that there's some amount of AI aversion from certain respondents. So there are definitely people who aren't necessarily as open to speaking to AI, and they'll put the phone down. That's
Right.
something that's inevitable in this kind of a test. But at the same time, as we've experienced in some of our other research, there's a group of people who prefer speaking to AI as well. So I'm sure there's a difference here and there's a mode effect. I think a lot of people, when they think about using AI to conduct phone interviews, they try to think about it as a replacement for human interviewers. And I think that's kind of the wrong mindset to have about this. Using AI to conduct public opinion research constitutes a new modality for data collection, in the same way that a web form is a different modality. And so, what we really have to think about from a research perspective is what are the impacts of this new mode? How do people respond differently? How does the actual data that we collect change? Because I'm sure that there is a ton of data that will be collected differently because we're disclosing to people that they're speaking to AI. And one easy example is yeah, we're going to talk to a different set of people, the set of people who are okay with speaking to AI, period. The other part of this is our disclosure was fairly lengthy. It took somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds on average to complete. And that's a pretty lengthy intro. I think as we'll get into when we start talking about the results of the study, there are some folks who are just not going to sit there for, an IRB sanctioned intro. Not that we had an IRB for this specific study, of course,
Sure.
but for many of the studies that we do conduct, we also have really, really long intros that are required by IRBs. And yeah, I mean, some respondents are not going to sit there for that long. And so, yeah, the short answer is yes, the disclosure definitely changes how people respond. And that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, like, I'm sure that this this is true of any methodology, right? Like, there are things that you need to do up front that will make people opt out. That's totally fine.
Yeah. And so the way that we wanted to evaluate the relative performance of each of the voices in the study was we wanted to study three main metrics. The first is we wanted to figure out how often people hung up during that intro. Like I said, it was very long. And so we wanted to understand, well, how often are people breaking off and does this differ between voices? That's probably a pretty straightforward signal of did the voice at some point after, for 30 seconds make you want to leave? But that's not enough, right? Because I'm sure people have a lot of different reasons for putting the phone down. It's not necessarily super clear that that is on the voice alone to kind of clarify. And so what we also wanted to understand was cooperation rate, or in more layman's terms, like completion rates, right? So of the people who stayed, how many people finished? How far did they get along the survey? And we wanted to also have a survival conditioned metric here to understand, well, given that you get to a certain time threshold, how likely are you to complete
Mm.
for each of the voices that we tested? And this kind of a survival metric, I think, is also really interesting in helping us understand the impact of the voice specifically, as opposed to, oh, I just didn't want to talk on the phone at this time, right? Which is kind of blurred by the hung up during intro or hootie metric that we discussed first. And then finally, the last metric that we wanted to discuss, or that we wanted to research rather, was the do not call rate. So do not calls are when you hop on the phone and you say, hey, never call me again. And we have to respect those. If someone says that, we take them off our list and we don't call them again. There are a bunch of exceptions to, or at least there's one exception to a bunch of automated calling laws for public opinion researchers. So public opinion researchers, because they're not selling anything, are allowed to make cold calls to US landlines. And we don't want to abuse that privilege, right? We don't want to get folks annoyed with the survey research community, let alone get annoyed with voice AI. However, from a research perspective, it is useful to understand whether there's some difference in hard opt-outs between voices or between providers. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. So you have hootie, which is like people are during the intro hang up during intro. You have the cooperation rate, which is the people that stay past the intro, how far are they getting? Um, or are they finishing the survey, right? And then you have completion efficiency, which is given their involvements past a certain amount of time, how likely are they to finish the call? And then you have the do not call rate, which is someone during the course of the call saying, never call me again.
Yeah, and I kind of mentally bucket the cooperation rates and completion efficiency together. So completion efficiency isn't necessarily like a standard metric in the survey research community, but it is an important metric for this study
Yeah.
because we're trying to, as much as possible, separate out the impact of the voice versus the impact of the instrument when we called and all of the other factors involved in the study. And so, for that reason, I think you need both the hootie rate, the hung up during intro rate, which tells us, hey, did the voice make you want to leave, and or did you have just some kind of bias against speaking to us from the get-go? And we need to combine that with the additional information that we get from what the cooperation rates were and what the survival condition metrics that we got were in terms of completions to get a full picture of the impact of each voice. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, completely makes sense. And so, do you feel like there's one of those metrics that's most likely to isolate the effect of the voice specifically rather than things like caller ID or survey fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, if you really pressed me on one of them, I'm gonna say it's the hung up during intro rate, right? Like, I think people do make judgments about voices pretty quickly. And so there is some nuance to that, of course, right? I mean, I think what time threshold and how long they have to hear the voice for in order to make
Mm.
that judgment is a matter for debate, and it's something that we probably need to do a lot more research into. But if you had me pick one, it would be the hootie rate because I think the cooperation rate overall is definitely influenced by the content of the study. And it's also influenced by, the type of person who's on the phone, right? Versus earlier on in the call, you probably do get a cleaner signal of the voice in particular. Although it isn't perfect, of course. Some people are always going to put the phone down no matter what voice they heard.
True. Cool. Awesome. Do you want to get into the findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first rate that we studied was the Hootie rate. And I actually do have some visuals that I can pull
Okay,
up,
cool.
to make this more real for us. So, here, let me share my screen. So, like I said, we called about 99.4K total. We made about 99.4K total calls for the study, and you can see kind of the results here. As you can probably imagine, we're not going to reach most people in a cold outbound research study, but we did still reach quite a few people, and we had some interesting results that came through. So the first result that we ended up looking into was, of course, about the Hootie rate. And so what we saw here was that on a provider level, Rime had the lowest Hootie rates overall. And this was statistically significant at the zero point zero 0.05 level, although, of course, this is exploratory analysis. No one should be drawing any kind of causal conclusions from any of this. What was interesting about these results, however, was that there wasn't a clear advantage for anyone in the very first 10 seconds. And, there are a number of possible reasons why this might have been the case. Our hypothesis is that in the first 10 seconds of the call, you're probably reacting to caller ID or, you're probably reacting to just the fact that you got a call out of the blue as opposed to something about the voice in particular. So our thought was to get useful information here, you have to have listened to at least a decent chunk of the call.
Basically, you're saying is like if you get a call and you don't, for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason, you don't want to take that call at that moment, the individual voice isn't going to be the largest contributor to you hanging up. You're going to be hanging up for some other reason.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's our hypothesis. I'm sure there's a ton of survey research literature out there that we may not necessarily be aware of, but I think it seems to make at least intuitive sense to me that in the very first few seconds, you're making a snap judgment about the call as opposed to the voice.
It's like you make the snap judgment about the call, and then it's only after that snap judgment is completed that you're making a snap judgment about something else, which is in some way the voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the other way that we looked at these Hootie rates was we also studied them by gender, right? So we had two male voices and two female voices for each of the providers that we analyzed. Oh, and by the way, one other quick methodology note,
Oh,
just to make sure that there wasn't one outlier voice that hurt any provider, for every single provider, we dropped their worst performer. And so, hopefully that we're trying to get the best foot forward to be placed. We want every provider to be able to place their best foot forward as opposed to having their overall results dragged down by one weaker performer. Obviously, we would have loved to test every single voice, but logistically that's not feasible. So this is one key methodological point that I want to clarify before we move forward.
Cool.
So that said, so these all involve looking at the top 3 performers for every single one of the providers that you see listed here. So in addition to the provider analysis that we did, we also looked at gender. So as I said, we wanted to see whether the gender coding of the voice impacted whether or not people put the phone down during that, 20 to 30-second long intro. And we did see a small difference, but you can see the data here. It wasn't statistically significant, and at least based on the prior research that we are aware of in terms of the gender of a human interviewer and hang up during intro rates, it seemed like this was pretty consistent. So
Mm,
I don't want to say that there's no effect here, but we didn't find one in this particular study.
got it.
And this one is actually something that I was kind of surprised by. Um, my intuition was the female coded voices would outperform the male coded voices by a long shot. And maybe this is just my bias because, the default Siri voice is female coded and the default Alexa voice is female coded. But I kind of figured that Americans would have been more accustomed to hearing female coded voices on the phone or in digital contexts.
I think everyone has that intuition, especially as it applies to voice AI. And in our experience working and helping power hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of calls, like, haven't seen that in the data whatsoever.
Yeah,
So
I mean, honestly, to me, that's a good thing. Like,
it's good. No, I think it is good.
yeah, I'm happy that we are all on a bit of a level playing field when it comes to having conversations with other people.
There was all
Um,
this, like, yeah, there's so much to be said about the, like, gender and voice assistance, but, yeah, I agree. I don't it's n not seeing it in the data is a good thing in my opinion.
yeah. So aside from Hootie rates, which, as I mentioned, the impact is complicated, right? Like maybe the first 10 seconds are the voice, maybe the first 10 seconds are the call. We saw an effect overall, but who's to say? One other way that we could analyze each of the 3 providers in turn was by looking at what we call cooperation rates in the survey research literature. So in the case of this study, Rhyme did have the highest observed cooperation rates, but it wasn't necessarily statistically significant. So, you know, the raw cooperation rates tell us, hey, how many people completed out of the number of people who were eligible to complete. And
Yeah.
so we have a table here that goes over some of that data. What we were also curious about, though, was completion efficiency, because, the Hootie rates told us one piece of the puzzle with regards to which voices performed best. But we were curious about, well, if we kind of remove the intro from the picture, if we assume that, like, you've gotten through the intro, was there one particular voice that performed differently from the rest? Or one particular category of voices that performed differently from the rest.
Yeah.
And so that's why we created this kind of survival conditioned metric here, which is completion given that you've reached a certain time threshold, because the goal was to isolate the impact of the voice. And so for this one, rhyme voices clearly performed best, and that's what the graph is that you see down here. And this was statistically significant, even after we did some corrections because of the fact that we were testing so many metrics. So in this case, we're testing 4 different metrics, right? Rhyme versus Google for we're testing Rhyme versus Google and Rhyme versus 11 Labs with respect to completions, and we actually have another related statistic here, which is completions and partial completes as well. And so for all of these 4 post-intro completion kind of survival metrics, we saw that Rhyme voices performed best. And so the question that we ask here is like, well, why? Right?
That's
Like,
the question I have because it's like I mean, obviously, it's cool that, like, if you stay on the phone with Rhyme for 30 seconds and you stay on the phone with Google for 30 seconds and you stay on the phone with 11 Labs for 30 seconds, you're still more likely to finish that call if you're talking to Rhyme, and I've been trying to be like, "Why?" And I'm curious to hear what you think.
yeah, I mean, one thing could be just the intangibles about the quality of the voice. Who knows? But I think one interesting quirk that we saw in our data was
Yeah.
that the rhyme voices also had the lowest median time to completion. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, actually, because I think one potential explanation is certain voices are more intelligible to people than others. It could be that people are more willing to complete just because they like certain voices, right? But I think there's an intelligibility component to this that we want to explore further in the future. Because if one set of voices or if one provider's voices had a lower median time to completion, to me, what that tells me is, well, potentially other voices led to problems mid-call, right? Like maybe the way that they pronounced a certain thing was confusing, or maybe they rushed through or slurred certain types of words. I'm not sure. We actually need to go back and listen to a lot more of these calls to get to a better answer there. But those are kind of two main explanations that I could think of.
Got it. Cool.
Um, but yeah, we were really excited about the completion and cooperation rates here, because I think this is a metric that is unique to the voice in a way that the Hootie rates are not as unique. Although I think that the Hootie rates are probably more descriptive overall in terms of telling us the impact of one provider versus another.
Yeah.
That
No, that
makes
makes complete sense.
Yeah, and so, we also looked at the cooperation rates by gender, and again, we did see that female voices had higher cooperation rates, but interestingly enough, when we look at those survival conditioned metrics, the male voices performed better. Neither of these differences really mattered. They were super tiny. Neither of them were statistically significant. But, in terms of exploratory results, we still think that this is a cool finding, right? Like, what this tells me is, hey, pick the voices that are right for your study. Don't over-index on the gender coding in particular, which is
Right.
not something intuitive. And we still have clients all the time who'll tell us something like, hey, we'd really like to see your selection of female voices in particular. And so this is data that we can point to say it shouldn't matter. Pick the voices that
Right.
work best for your study.
Right. Cool.
So after we looked at Hootie rates and completions or cooperation rates, the last major metric that we wanted to look at was do not call rates or hard opt out rates. And so, interestingly, Rhyme voices did have a statistically significantly higher do not call rate than either 11 Labs or Google. So Google and 11 Labs did perform better with respect to this one metric of do not call rates. What's weird to me is that both providers, as we just saw, also had worse results when it came to Hooties, and they had worse cooperation rates and survival conditioned kind of completion rates, right? And so this is like a weird conundrum, right? How can you possibly have worse performance on not getting people to not put the phone down, but better performance in terms of people not telling you, I never want to talk to you again?
I was thinking about this result too, because on the face of it, it seems like, oh, people must hate rhyme. And when you think about it for a second or two, beat or two beyond that initial reaction, you're like, actually, people are more honest with rhyme, right? Like,
Yeah.
they either would hang up or they would say before they hang up, hey, don't call me again. And by the way, they're telling this to something that they know is AI. Like, I want to be very, like, that. We need to remember that too. It's like they're taking the second to be like, hey, I appreciate this, but never call me again.
Yeah. And, like, honestly, like, my takeaway is just you're not going to opt out unless you stayed on the call long enough to bother, right? And so a hypothesis that I have is if you're getting a higher do not call rate, it might just be a side effect of engagement, not necessarily just rejection, right? The people who don't care and immediately hang up, they never even get to the point that they're going to say, do not call me. That's not to
Right.
say that we should be proud of this, right? Like, no one should
Sure.
want do not calls to happen. And, for us, from a data collection perspective, we want to minimize those too. But I think from a research perspective, our takeaway was, well, you need more than just a single metric to evaluate the performance of a given voice. That's why we were leaning on, cooperation rates and the survival condition metrics, as well as Hootie rates, in addition to the do not call rates.
How do people who are doing market research, opinion research think about do not call and opt out? Because I can imagine from a marketer's perspective, obviously it's not the best thing if someone clicks unsubscribe, but you also are getting therefore higher signal from the people who are still subscribed to your mailing list, as an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because in the public opinion research world, like a lot of modern day public opinion research tends to happen with what are called probability based panels. It's a
Mm.
survey methodology thing. I won't go into the details right now. But the long and short of it is, it takes a lot of time and energy and money to recruit people to join a panel. And for once you're in a panel, very often you are paying people, most of the time, you are paying people for each complete that they do. So, especially in a public opinion research context, do not call rates are important, right? Because you don't want to annoy your panelists. But at the end of the day, the headline metric that most of these folks are going to be evaluating is, well, how many completes did we get? How likely are we to get those completes? And so I think it's a complicated story, right? Like, do not call rates do matter in a public opinion research and market research context, but not just in and of themselves, rather because of what they represent financially in terms of the investment that these firms have in their overall respondent base.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Okay, so this is, to my knowledge, just for what it's worth, right? Like we have partners that run this kind of benchmark themselves, right? We have partners who, before choosing Rime, put 11 labs and Rime into some production environment and do an A/B test and prove this to themselves, at least with one or two voices. And so,
Mhm.
like, given all of this, right? Like, why do you think Miravoice is the first team to do this in what I I just have to say is like both at once a very nuanced but also a very thorough way, and instead has treated the voice in the application as pretty much an afterthought, right? Like as an
Yeah.
option in a drop down. When I think what we're showing is that like there are real behavioral at both at scale and not at scale
Yeah.
ramifications, right? When because voice is so something that we're so very richly, exquisitely attuned to. Like, why, in your opinion, have people not begun to think about this in this way?
I think there are a couple of different reasons. I mean, the first is I don't think a lot of folks have the resources or the tech to call 36,000 landlines all around the country, make 100,000 calls, and actually do the test. It's just a hard thing to measure. And so, because of that, people are just like, like, we'll just have a couple of employees listen to some voices. It's probably good enough. And then they go with that. And that's fine. Like that's not an unreasonable thing for folks to do. It just so happens that in a survey research context where the whole name of the game is talking to lots and lots and lots of people, this becomes a much more important question to evaluate, which is why we wanted to do it.
Sure.
Um, and I think the other aspect of this is I think because it's just so human to think about voice and to think about interactions with these types of systems, I think people just trust their intuition a lot more than like I think people have a sense that their intuition about this problem is a lot more accurate than it is, right? I certainly thought so. Like
Well,
I came into this with a yeah, I thought it was more likely than not that we would see a clear impact to female coded voices at being, better performers. And what we ended up seeing was, well, not really, right? And I think because voice is so fundamental to the human experience, people are too overconfident about their ability to evaluate it and evaluate its impacts. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's just probably just hard to test this kind of thing in a production environment, right?
so do you have any advice for people who are building like a like I'll say this, right? Like it's true that people don't have the tech, but also the statistical expertise to run this kind of test themselves. And I agree with your diagnosis that people trust their intuition maybe more than data itself, because again we're very attuned to this voice, right? Like we have judgments, everyone has judgments. And
Yeah.
so like what advice would you give to someone who like is running uh and something like an inbound customer support, very different use case, but certainly right, getting hundreds of thousands of phone calls over the course of the month? Like what advice would you give to them?
I think there's three main pieces of advice. The
Mm,
first is take voice seriously, right? Voice should be an actual design parameter in the product that you're building or the study that you're designing. It's not just like a throwaway implementation detail where you like pick it once and then you call it a day, right? You should be applying the same level of care and attention to your voice selection as you do to other parts of your product or other parts of your study. And the way that you can do that in practice is by testing multiple voices on your production traffic, right? So what we saw in this study is that we didn't get the we didn't have the time to get into this, but there's a lot of variation at a specific voice level. And so, what worked for us in this study may not necessarily work for a customer support use case or a sales use case or whatever other use case that might exist out there. And so the big question that you should ask is, hey, how many voices can we test? And what's the actual data that we're getting on engagement from each of these voices? The second piece of advice is directly related to that, which is when you do study the engagement of each of these multiple voices, make sure that you look at more than just one headline metric. Like we looked at here, there's a tension between the do not call rates that we saw, as well as the cooperation rates and the Hootie rates, right? And so what that means is you need a holistic picture of what engagement in your specific use case means. And so, a kind of related piece of advice is interpret any kind of hard opt-outs or refusals in the context of what you're doing, right? So just like how we saw that tension between DNC and completion and Hootie rates in our study, it's important for folks who are just building voice AI systems in general to also be thoughtful about what a refusal means. Is a refusal telling you that your product has a problem? Is it telling you that you have selected the wrong voice? Or is it a completely different result entirely? I can't answer that question for you. No one can, but it's important that you keep it in mind.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think looking forward, like, as these models become even more capable, of course, there's always gonna be people who are hanging up, but can you imagine a future in which, like, the personality of the voice agent, the voice of the voice agent becomes, in some ways, like, the main design consideration? Maybe it's different in public opinion research where you have to control for what is said beyond, how it's said, but I can imagine that becomes a variable that's testable at scale too.
I think it's going to have to be. Um, Look, I think as digital systems get more complex and as we have more AI agents in various parts of our lives, yeah, personality is going to be incredibly important to evaluate. And there's so many different aspects of personality, right? Like the actual words that are being used as well as what the voice is. And to be honest, with the culture of A/B testing that everyone built up in the 2010s for ad tracking, I can only hope that the same level of rigor is
Yeah,
applied to AI systems, voices, personalities, and the like.
100%. Cool. Well, this has been awesome talking with you, Shreyas. Really glad that we got to support this study and, yeah, just excited to continue to support you and Miravoice in general moving forward.
Thank you so much. Can't wait to do more and can't wait to actually dig into, the frequency analysis of the voices and the pitch and, do all sorts of cool research with this kind of tech in the future. So thanks for giving us the
Awesome.
opportunity and, it was great chatting with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Shreyas.